At 436 Remuria Road in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the porch light stayed on late into certain evenings. The street outside was the kind of quiet that collects in northern New England towns after 9 o'clock, not empty exactly, but settled, the houses holding their warmth inward against the cold, the bare trees along the sidewalk standing still. The porch light at number 436 was ordinary in every respect. It cast the same pale cone of light onto the same wooden steps that it always had. The house behind it was modest and well kept. The kind of house where the mail was sorted neatly and the curtains were drawn against the dark by a particular time each night, and where two people moved through their evenings with the comfortable purposefulness of a household that knew its own routines. The two people inside that house in the early 1960s were Barney Hill and Betty Hill. Their life together at 436 Remuria Road had the texture of lives that had been carefully built rather than simply accumulated. There was order to it. There was intention to it. The house was not remarkable from the street, and neither Barney nor Betty Hill would have described themselves as remarkable people. What the documentary record of their lives shows, when it is read carefully, is something rather more interesting than remarkability. It shows two individuals who had constructed, between them, a life of considerable civic seriousness and professional precision, two people who were, in the vocabulary of every institution they moved through, regarded as credible. Barney Hill was born on July 20th, 1922, in Newport News, Virginia. He was a tall, measured man with a measured way of speaking, the kind of calm that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from the habit of holding feeling steadily. By the time he and Betty were living at 436 Remuria Road, he was employed as a mail sorter at the United States Post Office in Portsmouth, working night shifts with enough regularity that late night hours and late night roads were simply part of the shape of his week. Night driving was not unusual for him. Arriving home in the dark hours was not unusual for him. These were the rhythms of a working life, documented and unremarkable. What was less ordinary in the context of early 1960s New Hampshire, certainly was the additional dimension of his public life. Governor John W. King had appointed Barney Hill to serve on the New Hampshire Civil Rights Commission. The appointment was not ceremonial. It placed him inside the institutional machinery of civil rights work in a state that was, at that time, reckoning slowly with questions the rest of the country was reckoning loudly. Barney attended meetings. He sat at tables under institutional lighting, with papers arranged in front of him. Colleagues who worked alongside him on the commission would later describe him in the specific language that investigators and journalists recorded as principled and steady. He was not a man who spoke recklessly or who acted without consideration of what the record would show. The NAACP meetings he attended in Rockingham County in the early years of that decade were another thread in the same fabric. There is something worth sitting with in the specific image those meetings produce. Barney Hill at a table in a meeting room somewhere in Rockingham County. The light overhead, the particular flat white of institutional overhead lighting. The agenda on the table, the conversation proceeding with the seriousness of people who understood that what they were discussing had real consequences for real lives. His voice in those rooms was described as measured. His arguments were described as careful. These were the assessments of people who had sat across from him and listened, and who would repeat them to investigators who came asking later. Betty Hill's professional life had its own kind of precision. She had earned her master's degree in social work, a credential that represented years of academic work, followed by the particular discipline of translating that work into daily professional practice. She was employed as a child welfare worker for the state of New Hampshire, and the nature of that work is worth holding clearly in mind. Child welfare work demands observation of a specific and demanding kind. It demands the capacity to enter a situation, assess what is actually present, rather than what one expects to find, note it accurately, and produce documentation that will withstand scrutiny. Betty Hill's supervisors, across the years of her employment in that role, consistently affirmed that she possessed these capacities. The word that appeared most often in the assessments recorded by investigators, speaking to people who had worked with her, was not kind, and it was not warm, though both of those things were also said. It was credible. At her desk in a New Hampshire state office, reviewing a case file, Betty Hill was the kind of person around whom the work of the office organized itself in a particular way. The window behind her desk would have shown a gray New England morning, more often than not, the particular gray that sits over Portsmouth for much of the year. Low and patient, her handwriting in the margins of case files was careful and even. She was a person who noticed things and wrote them down, and who trusted documentation over memory, because documentation was what her profession ran on. This is not a small detail. It is, in fact, one of the most important things to understand about Betty Hill before anything unusual had occurred in her life at all. Barney and Betty Hill had married in 1960. Their marriage was, in the landscape of early 1960s New Hampshire, an unusual fact. They were one of a very small number of legally married interracial couples in the state at that time. The Loving Virginia decision, which would extend the legal protection of such marriages nationwide, was still 7 years away when Barney and Betty Hill stood together and made their legal commitment to one another. The fact of their marriage in that place and at that time was not a background detail. It was a daily reality they navigated with the same steady purposefulness that characterized everything else in the documentary record of their shared life. They had chosen one another in full knowledge of what that choice meant in their particular social and legal context, and they had built a household together that was, by every account that survives, a functioning and coherent one. The routine of 436 Remower Road was documented well enough to understand its shape. Barney worked nights, which meant that the particular texture of their domestic life included early morning arrivals and late-night departures as regular, unremarkable features. Betty managed her caseload during the day and carried her professional habits home with her, in the way that people who care deeply about their work inevitably do. The house was orderly, the routines were clear. People who knew them, neighbors, colleagues, people from the organizations they moved through, would later describe visiting 436 Remower Road as the experience of a home that felt grounded, stable, the kind of place where things were where they were supposed to be. Multiple character witnesses attested to this stability in formal and informal ways before any unusual event had occurred, and their assessments form a coherent picture when laid side by side. Colleagues from the post office spoke about Barney's reliability. Colleagues from the Civil Rights Commission spoke about his seriousness of purpose. Betty's professional supervisors spoke about her observational precision and her resistance to imprecision in documentation. Neighbors spoke about both of them in the vocabulary of people describing other people they had found to be straightforwardly what they presented themselves to be. The organization NICAP, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, was in the early 1960s among the most rigorous civilian organizations engaged in the systematic collection and analysis of reported aerial anomalies. Its director was Major Donald Kehoe, a former Marine Corps aviator and author whose public profile in matters related to reported aerial phenomena was substantial. Kehoe was not easily impressed. He had spent years sifting through reports, many of which did not survive the kind of basic evidentiary scrutiny he applied to them, and his organization's reputation rested on its commitment to treating only those cases that met a high threshold of investigative seriousness. The fact that Kehoe was personally briefed following a letter he received is a piece of information that belongs in any honest account of who Barney and Betty Hill were and what the institutional response to their account looked like from the beginning. But that letter and its reception comes after. Before any of that, there was simply the house at 436 Remuera Road, and the lives lived in it, and the particular solidity of two people who had found one another and built something together that the available record describes, without exception, as genuine. It is worth staying inside that solidity for a moment longer. The early 1960s in New Hampshire had a specific texture that is easy to lose when the events that followed are already known and already casting their retrospective light backward. Portsmouth was a naval town. The shipyard employed a substantial portion of the population. The political and civic life of the state was organized around institutions that moved slowly and expected their participants to move within understood limits. Barney Hill, the black man from Virginia, working the night shift at the post office and serving on the Civil Rights Commission by gubernatorial appointment, and Betty Hill, a professionally trained social worker with a master's degree managing state-level child welfare cases, were people who had negotiated the specific social terrain of that place and time with enough success to have arrived at the positions they held and the reputation they had accumulated. That negotiation was not automatic. That required the sustained application of exactly the qualities that their colleagues and neighbors would later describe: steadiness, honesty, professional precision. When people in positions like theirs sought documentation rather than speculation, it was because documentation was the currency their professional worlds ran on. When they wrote things down, it was because writing things down was what they did when they encountered something they needed to understand. And when something they encountered lay outside the boundaries of ordinary explanation, the instinct that training and temperament and years of professional practice had built in them was not to dismiss what they had observed, and not to amplify it beyond what the observation actually contained, but to record it as carefully as they could, and seek the appropriate channels through which careful records could be examined by appropriate people. Betty Hill had read Donald Kehoe's book Flying Saucers from Outer Space before any of the events that would make her name known beyond Portsmouth and beyond New Hampshire. The image of her reading it at the kitchen table in their house on Remuera Road is specific and grounded, the book's plain cover face up on the table beside her coffee cup, the house around her quiet in the particular way of a house where one person is home and the other is at work. She read it with the same attentiveness she brought to her case files. She noted what Kehoe documented and what he concluded and what he held open. She was not on the evidence of everything she had done before and everything she would do after a credulous reader. She was a trained observer reading a trained investigator's account of documented anomalies, and the quality of her engagement with the material was consistent with how she engaged with all material. Barney Hill sorting mail at the Portsmouth post office on a night shift is another image that deserves its full weight before any narrative of what came later is permitted to simplify it. The building nearly empty at that hour, the rhythmic sound of envelopes moving through his hands, the street outside dark, and the rest of Portsmouth settled into its quiet. His work was physical and repetitive, and required a different kind of attention than his Civil Rights Commission work, the attention of hands that knew their task and carried it out with the particular competence of people who have done something long enough that it moves through them rather than around them. He was a man who worked with his hands and with his mind in different hours, and who carried both dimensions of his life with the same steadiness. The two of them in the domestic space of 436 Remuera Road were not extraordinary. They were orderly. They were serious. They were the kind of people who were considered reliable by the institutions and communities they moved through, not because they sought that reputation, but because they had consistently acted in ways that justified it. Their marriage, their shared household, their professional lives, their civic commitments, all of it added up to a portrait of two people who had chosen again and again to show up as precisely and honestly as they could in the circumstances their lives had placed them in. The nightcap director's personal briefing following Betty Hill's letter to him was not, from his institutional perspective, a courtesy extended without evaluation. Kehoe and his investigators applied the same evidentiary thresholds to incoming accounts that they applied to everything else that crossed their desks. A letter arriving from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, from a woman who identified herself as a child welfare worker employed by the state, whose husband served on the Civil Rights Commission by gubernatorial appointment, whose account was specific and whose presentation of it was orderly, and whose instinct in the face of something she could not explain was to reach for documentation rather than away from it. That letter cleared whatever threshold NCAP maintained for cases worth taking seriously. Walter Webb, one of NCAP's field investigators, was dispatched. The formal written report he produced was submitted in October of 1961. The institutional machinery of serious investigation had already been set in motion before any hypnotist had been consulted, before any media account had circulated, before the Hill's name was attached to anything beyond their own neighborhood and their own professional worlds. The letter Betty Hill wrote to Kehoe was careful. It was organized. It described what she and Barney had observed in the specific sequential language of a person trained to make observation precise and to resist embellishment. It named times and locations. It noted physical details. It acknowledged what she could account for and flagged what she could not. The letter was not the communication of someone seeking attention or validation. It was the communication of someone who had encountered something she could not categorize within any existing framework and who had reached instinctively toward the most credible institutional channel she knew of for putting unusual aerial observations on record. The books on the Hill's shelves, the case files in Betty's professional briefcase, the commission papers on Barney's table at the NAACP meeting in Rockingham County. All of it adds up to a portrait of people for whom the document was the basic unit of reality, the thing that made experience legible and transmissible and available to scrutiny. When Betty Hill sat down at the kitchen table in Portsmouth and wrote to Donald Kehoe, she was doing exactly what her training and her temperament had always disposed her to do. She was not dramatizing. She was recording. She was reaching toward the person and the institution best positioned to receive what she had to say and treat it with the seriousness she believed it warranted. The porch light at 436 Remuera Road in Portsmouth continued to illuminate the same wooden steps, the same quiet street, the same northern New England stillness that had always been there. The house remained orderly. The routines continued. Barney sorted mail on the night shift. Betty reviewed her case files under the gray New Hampshire morning. The letter had been written and sent. Major Donald Kehoe, in his Washington office, had received it and read it and judged it worth a personal briefing. Walter Webb was preparing to travel to Portsmouth. The documentary record of the Hill case, that accumulating body of letters and reports and formal interviews and physical evidence had already begun. What is worth holding in the quiet of the image that 436 Remuera Road produces is not the strangeness that was coming, but the solidity of the ground from which the account would emerge. Two people with long records of professional precision and civic seriousness, living in a house on a quiet street in a northern New England town, had encountered something they could not explain, and their first response had been to do the thing that every other dimension of their lives had trained them to do. They had written it down. They had sent it to the right person. They had opened the door, not away from documentation, but toward it, steadily, carefully, in the exact manner that everyone who had ever worked alongside them would have recognized as characteristic. The bare trees along Remuera Road stood still in the dark. The porch light held its small cone of pale light on the front steps of number 436. Barney Hill was at the post office moving envelopes through the quiet hours of a night shift, and Betty Hill had already written, in her clear and careful handwriting, the letter that would bring the world's attention to what they had seen on the road through the White Mountains and could not explain. The letter was in the mail. The investigation had begun. USO Nullival is hiding Bedienstolen. Jurikalving. USO Nullival. Gewines auf Thieg. Nisenside and Boys. And there it is out to the toast office. Route 3 runs south through the White Mountains of New Hampshire in a long, mostly unlit corridor between walls of granite and dense northern forest. In September, the trees along the ridge are still full, the dark mass of them pressed against either side of the highway, and on a clear night, the sky above the notch opens wide and deep between the tree lines. The road is narrow. It carries very little traffic after 9 in the evening. In Franconia Notch, where the mountains press closest together and the granite walls rise on both sides, the artificial lights of towns and farms fall away almost entirely, and what remains is the road itself, the headlights moving forward, and the sky above the pass, unobscured and full. On the evening of September 19th, 1961, Barney and Betty Hill drove south on that road toward Portsmouth, returning from a vacation in Niagara Falls and Montreal. They had taken the trip without particular incident. They had eaten dinner at a Howard Johnson's in Colebrook earlier in the evening, and by the time they entered the mountains, the hour was late and the road was essentially theirs. The 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air moved steadily through the dark, its headlights reaching a fixed distance ahead on the asphalt, and behind it and above it, the sky held its stars without interference from any town. Betty Hill was the first to notice the light. She described it as bright and distinct. It sat above the horizon in a way that drew her attention, not because it was immediately alarming, but because it moved in a way she did not recognize. She watched it for a period of time before saying anything. What she was trying to determine as she watched it through the passenger window was whether the movement fit any pattern she already knew. Aircraft banking, a satellite traveling its arc, a planet low on the horizon, shifting with the curvature of the road. None of those categories held. The light moved in ways that did not match any of them cleanly, and the more she watched it, the more apparent that became. Barney had not yet seen it. He was driving south through the notch, with his attention on the road ahead, the mountain pass quiet, and the headlights cutting their familiar corridor through the dark. Betty spoke. She pointed toward what she was watching. He looked, and then looked again, and what he saw was bright enough and distinct enough that he slowed the car on the empty highway to look at it more carefully. The light appeared to be tracking them. That was the word that came closest, in subsequent accounts, to describing what they observed over the following minutes, that the object was not on a fixed trajectory, independent of the car, but was moving in relation to them, holding a position that shifted as they shifted, maintaining a presence in the sky above and ahead. Barney drove more slowly. He pulled the car to a stop on the shoulder at a point in Franconia Notch where the roadside opened enough to park. He retrieved his binoculars from the back seat, the same military-grade binoculars he had carried as a standard precaution on night drives, and stepped outside. The night air in Franconia Notch in September carries a particular quality of stillness. The granite is cold. The forest, pressed close on either side of the road, holds its sounds, and the sounds are small ones. The movement of air through the highest branches, the occasional creak of the road surface cooling. The car idled behind him, the driver's door left open, and Barney raised the binoculars toward the light above the mountain pass and looked through them for the first time. What he reported seeing through those lenses was not a distant point of light. He described a large disc-shaped craft with a double row of windows arranged around its circumference, the windows lit from within, and figures visible behind the glass. Figures standing at those windows and oriented, as he described it, outward, as though looking down at the road, and the car stopped on it below. He stood in the cold air of the notch with the binoculars held to his face, and looked at the object for long enough that the detail he later described had time to register. The double row of windows, the shape of the craft behind them, the figures at the glass. He lowered the binoculars. The object appeared to be descending toward the road. Betty Hill remained in the passenger seat during some of this time, and her account describes watching Barney standing in the road with the binoculars raised. A figure at the edge of the headlight's reach, the open landscape of the notch above him, and the object moving against the sky. Her training as a professional observer, honed through years of fieldwork in child welfare, through careful documentation, through the specific discipline of noting what is actually present rather than what is expected, informed the attention she was paying. She was registering what was in front of her and filing it, not in a notebook yet, but in the particular mental record of someone who had spent years knowing that what she noticed could matter later. Barney ran back to the car. That was how the moment was described in his subsequent account. He ran. He was not walking at a measured pace or moving with careful deliberateness. He ran back to the car with the binoculars in his hand, their straps swinging, and got in and pulled the door shut and drove south. His own account of that moment describes a sharp spike of something very much like fear, though in his language it was framed as an urgent, instinctive need to leave that place. The object had been descending. He had been standing in the road below it. The two facts together had produced a response that bypassed conscious calculation. Betty said nothing, at least initially, that was designed to calm him or to argue against what he was feeling. She watched him. She watched the road ahead. She watched the sky above the windshield as the car moved forward, and the object, by her report, was still there, still present above them as they drove, still holding its position relative to the car, with a persistence that the speed of the vehicle and the passage of the miles did not diminish. The road south of Franconia Notch carries the driver through a long, dark descent toward the towns of Lincoln and Woodstock before opening into a broader valley. There were very few other vehicles on the road that night. The Hills drove through this stretch with the object still visible above them, still apparently tracking the car, its light unchanged against the sky. The silence inside the car was the silence of two people attending carefully to the same thing from slightly different angles. Barney focused on the road and the edges of it. Betty focused on the sky above the windshield and the behavior of the light above them. It was somewhere in this stretch of the drive that both Hills reported hearing a series of sounds. The sounds were described as rhythmic and tonal, a kind of buzzing or beeping that seemed to come from outside the car, or from the body of the car itself, not clearly locatable to a single direction. The tone of it was distinct from road noise, and distinct from any mechanical behavior they recognized from the Bel Air. Betty reported it. Barney heard it too. The sounds continued for a period, and then they did not. And by the accounts both Hills gave in subsequent months, the cessation of the sounds corresponded roughly with a shift in the quality of their awareness, a kind of thinning or interruption in the continuous thread of the drive as they had been experiencing it. What Barney reported next when pressed on the sequence in detail was that at some point along this stretch of road, he experienced an impulse to turn off Route 3 onto a side road. The impulse was strong enough that he followed it. He turned the wheel, and the car left the main highway. The specific character of the impulse, as he described it, was unusual. It was not a thought he recognized as originating from his own navigation or preference. It was closer to a directive, something encountered rather than decided. He could not identify a reason for the turn at the time, and he could not reconstruct one afterward. The side road he turned onto was not a road either of them knew. It was unlit and ran through forested land, and the Bel Air moved slowly along it with its headlights showing trees on either side and nothing visible ahead. What happened in the time that followed on that road, both Hills were unable to account for from conscious memory. What they could account for was arriving back on Route 3 at some later point, the car again on the main highway, moving south, both of them present and driving, but with no clear continuous recollection of the interval between the turn and their return to the road. This gap, the interval that would later be calculated and documented and examined from multiple directions, did not present itself immediately as a gap. That was one of the more notable aspects of their account, as investigators later considered it. Neither Barney nor Betty pulled over on the highway after the return to Route 3 and said with full clarity that something had gone missing from the night. What they experienced was more like a seam or a splice, the drive continuing without a felt rupture, but the felt continuity concealing a discontinuity that the clock and the road and the evidence of their physical condition would later make visible. They drove on. The mountains were behind them, the road widened and the towns increased in frequency, and the lights of New Hampshire's small cities appeared at intervals through the windshield. Barney drove. Betty watched the sky. The object was no longer visible. Near Ashland, New Hampshire, roughly 30 miles south of Franconia Notch, the Hills heard a second series of the rhythmic beeping tones. The character of this second occurrence matched the first closely enough that both described it with the same language in their separate accounts. Rhythmic, tonal, coming from outside or from the car itself. And with this second series of sounds, both Hills reported returning to a more complete and continuous awareness of their surroundings, becoming, as Betty's account put it, more fully present in the drive than they had felt themselves to be in the interval before the sounds. The road ahead was lit. The town of Ashland was there through the windshield. The car was moving at a normal speed. Barney was holding the wheel in both hands. The clock on the dashboard showed a time, and the road behind them showed a distance, and the two did not match what the night had felt like from the inside. It was not yet an emergency. It was not yet a crisis. The sensation, as the Hills described it separately and in later reconstructions, was closer to a kind of puzzlement, the particular experience of reaching into a recent memory and finding less there than should be present. The way a conversation sometimes leaves fewer traces than the importance of it would seem to demand. They drove south toward Portsmouth. They spoke. They noted, somewhere in that stretch, that the drive was taking longer than it should, or that their sense of elapsed time did not align with the position they were in on the route. But the car was intact, and they were intact, and the lights of the highway were ahead of them, and they continued. The sky above the notch was entirely clear on the night of September 19th, 1961. That fact matters for a reason that has nothing to do with atmosphere and everything to do with visibility conditions. On a clear night with no cloud cover, above a highway with minimal artificial lighting, the stars over Franconia Notch are numerous, and the sky between them is genuinely dark. Witnesses on such a night have unobstructed lines of sight to significant altitude. What they see above them is not obscured or compressed by cloud or light pollution into ambiguity. What Betty Hill watched through the passenger window of the Bel Air, and what Barney watched through the binoculars with his feet on the cold pavement of the rest area, was visible because the conditions for visibility were as good as they are likely to be on any night in New Hampshire in September. Betty's account of the object's behavior during the early minutes of the sighting, before Barney stopped the car and before the binoculars were raised, is notable in its specificity about what the movement was not. She was eliminating possibilities as she watched. She was working through the known categories of what appears in the sky at night and moves, and she was noting, category by category, why this object did not fit them. The movement was inconsistent with the track of a commercial aircraft. Commercial aircraft do not change direction without a wide, gradual arc, and their lights follow a predictable pattern of strobing and navigation beacons. The movement was inconsistent with a satellite, which follows a fixed trajectory without deviation. The movement was inconsistent with a meteor or with any phenomenon she could name that would account for an object appearing to hold a position and then shift it in response to the motion of the road below. She was not, by her own account, frightened at this stage. She was attentive. The object was interesting. It was moving in a way that demanded explanation, and she was in the process of working through what explanations were available and finding them inadequate one by one. Barney's response when Betty first drew his attention to the light had the quality of a person entertaining a range of prosaic explanations and watching them fall away. He looked again. He slowed the car, not out of alarm, but out of the specific impulse to see the thing more clearly before deciding what it was. He was not a man who moved quickly to dramatic conclusions. His work on the Civil Rights Commission had trained him in the discipline of distinguishing what was documented from what was assumed. His years at the post office had given him the particular steadiness of someone accustomed to night work, to empty streets, to the ordinary dark. The light above the mountain pass was extraordinary enough that it made him slow down and then stop and then reach for the binoculars. Standing at the rest area in Franconia Notch with the binoculars raised, Barney had the experience of the object coming into focus. This is the part of his account that would draw the most sustained attention in the years that followed, not because it was embellished or because it grew in the retelling, but because the level of detail he described was specific and consistent across multiple separate tellings. The disc shape, the double row of windows, the figures behind the glass, these were not additions that appeared gradually over months of retelling. They were present in the first accounts he gave, and they were present in the accounts he gave under clinical hypnosis 3 years later, and they were present in the accounts he gave to investigators who were specifically trained to probe for inconsistency. The figures at the windows were described as observing the car. That detail, the quality of mutual observation, The sense that the encounter was not entirely one-directional was something Barney returned to in multiple descriptions. He was watching through binoculars. They were at the windows of the object. Both were looking at the same interval of space between them. Whatever it was that he saw in that moment was specific enough to produce the response that came next, which was not a measured decision to return to the car, but something faster and more physical than that, the binoculars coming down from his face, his feet already moving, the car door open ahead of him, the engine running where he had left it. Betty had been watching through the windshield. She had watched Barney standing in the road at the edge of the headlights with the binoculars held to his face, and she had watched the object above him, and she had been doing what she always did when looking at something that required careful attention, noting it, registering it, holding it. When Barney ran back to the car and got in and drove south, she did not protest the departure. The object was still there. It was above them as the car moved, and the road was ahead, and the night was continuing. What Betty Hill did in the days immediately following this drive, before any investigator had approached the hills, before any formal inquiry had opened, before the account had been shared with anyone outside their immediate circle, was to sit down and write. She had telephoned her sister Janet in Kingston, New Hampshire, the morning after the drive, and she had described what had happened. That call established a timestamp on the account that investigators would later note with care. The description of the encounter existed in the world before any interest from outside had encouraged or shaped it. The call to Janet was not an announcement. It was not a press release. It was a sister calling a sister the morning after something unusual had happened on a road in New Hampshire, saying carefully what she had seen, and then Betty wrote. She wrote to Major Donald Kehoe at the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, NICAP, in a letter that documented the encounter with the same particularity that her professional training had given her. The date of the drive, the location, the characteristics of the object, the sequence of events as she could account for them, the characteristics of the object's movement that she had catalogued as she sat in the passenger seat of the Bel Air. The letter was careful and specific, and it reached NETCAP, and NETCAP sent an investigator, but the letter came first, before the investigator, before the sessions that would come years later, before any of the formal apparatus of documentation and analysis had engaged with the case. Betty Hill had written a letter to a responsible authority and described what she and her husband had experienced in detail with her name on it. That is the specific shape of how the Hills first made the incident part of the record. Not reluctantly, not after pressure, not because someone came to them and asked. She reached toward documentation before documentation reached toward her. On the road through Franconia Notch that night, just before Barney ran back to the car, the sky above the granite walls of the notch was clear and wide and full of stars. The object was above the tree line and visible and descending, by Barney's account, toward the road. He had seen through the binoculars what he described. He lowered the lenses. He ran. The car door was still open where he had left it. The engine was still running. The road south was dark and ahead of them and long. He got in. He pulled the door shut. The car moved forward on the highway. And above them, in the open sky, above the mountain pass, the object was still present, its position unchanged, its light the same bright particular quality it had carried since Betty first noticed it from the passenger window, its behavior still outside the range of the categories either of them had available to contain it. The road ran south through the notch, and then out of it, and the hills fell away on either side, and the car moved through the dark with the headlights ahead of it and the sky above it, and the miles to Portsmouth still to go. Nothing was resolved in that moment. Nothing was named or explained or accounted for. The car was moving south on a New Hampshire highway on a clear September night, and two people were inside it, and something was above them in the sky, and the outcome of the next 2 hours was not yet known to either of them, and would not in any fully satisfying sense become known later. The drive continued, the dark continued, and behind them, over the granite notch and the bare top of Indian Head and the forest pressing against the road on both sides, the stars held their positions in the open sky, the same stars that had been there before the light appeared, the same stars that would be there after the car disappeared around the next bend in the road, heading south toward Portsmouth and home. Barney's hands were on the wheel. The binoculars were in the car, their strap swinging free where it hung from the case on the back seat, the same binoculars he had raised to his eyes in the cold night air of the rest area, the same lenses through which he had seen the windows and the figures at the windows, the same strap that would later be found snapped rather than worn, with no account available for what had produced the break. But that was later. That was the morning of September 20th, in a kitchen in Portsmouth, under a different kind of light. For now, the strap was intact and swinging, and the car was moving, and the road was ahead, and the object was above. The drive south through the White Mountains on the night of September 19th, 1961, covered roughly 90 miles between the point of the initial sighting and the outskirts of Portsmouth. Those 90 miles took the hills through terrain that thinned gradually from the deep isolation of the mountain pass into the more populated landscape of central New Hampshire, small towns appearing at longer intervals, the occasional lit storefront or roadside sign, the dark between them gradually less absolute. Route 3 carries its travelers through this transition without drama. The road is the same road. The miles accumulate in the ordinary way. Betty watched the sky above the windshield for most of the drive south. The object was present for a portion of that distance, and then it was not, and she noted the transition and held it. Barney drove. The particular quality of his silence in the car, as Betty described it later, was not the silence of someone who had decided nothing unusual had happened and was returning to normal. It was the silence of someone holding something carefully, the way a person holds something that might break if handled wrong. He drove south on Route 3, and the miles went under the wheels of the Bel Air, and the night moved through its hours in the dark above the car. Near Ashland, the lights appeared, a small town through the windshield, the road suddenly more lit, the sky above the town, the particular softened dark of a place, with enough ground-level light to give the sky above it a faint ambient glow. Both hills described returning to a fuller awareness of the drive at approximately this point in the journey, after the second series of beeping tones had sounded and stopped. The quality of that return, its sudden completeness after an interval that felt, from the inside, only slightly discontinuous, was something both of them had difficulty putting precisely into language. Not a jolt, not a resumption, something softer than either of those words, and more difficult to locate in ordinary experience. The clock on the dashboard showed its time. The road behind them showed its distance. The car was warm and intact and moving at a normal speed. They were still on Route 3. Ashland was in the windshield, and then it was passing, and then it was behind them, and the road south was open. They drove on toward Portsmouth. They were quiet in a particular way. They were aware of the sky and of the time, and of the way the night had not been entirely the night they had expected when they pulled out of the Howard Johnson's parking lot in Colebrook hours earlier. They were aware of the strangeness. They were not, at this point, frightened by it in any way that paralyzed them. They were aware of it the way careful, attentive people are aware of things that have not yet been explained, holding it at a slight, considered distance, letting the road continue, letting the miles accumulate, moving south through the New Hampshire dark toward the porch light at 436 Remuer Road, in the particular stillness of a Portsmouth street in the first hours of the morning. The car moved through it all. The engine ran. The headlights held their corridor ahead of them on the empty highway, and Barney Hill drove south with both hands on the wheel, the binoculars on the back seat with their straps swinging, and the sky above them wide and clear and full of the same stars that had been there all along, patient and fixed and saying nothing. The car pulled into the driveway at 436 Remuera Road in the pre-dawn hours of September 20th, 1961, and stopped. The porch light was still on. It had been on since they left, 2 days before, when the drive north to Niagara Falls had begun as an ordinary trip, a weekend away, a familiar route through New England, nothing marked on the calendar that would explain what the clock on the dashboard was now showing against the darkness outside the windshield. Barney Hill switched off the engine. Neither of them moved immediately. The street around them was quiet in the way that streets are quiet at that hour, not empty so much as settled, the neighborhood folded inward, the houses dark, the trees still. Portsmouth in September holds that particular stillness. Well, it was roughly 5 in the morning. The drive from the White Mountains to Portsmouth runs about 150 miles, and the Hills had left Franconia Notch somewhere around 10:30 the previous night. The arithmetic, when they sat with it, did not resolve. It left a space of somewhere near 2 hours that neither of them could account for with any consciously remembered stop, any detour they could trace, any conversation or pause that would explain where that time had gone. They got out of the car. The morning air was cool. Barney retrieved their luggage from the trunk, and it was there, standing in the driveway under the porch light, the neighborhood still asleep around them, that Betty noticed the hem of her dress. It was torn, for the zipper had pulled away from the fabric along part of its track, the stitching undone in a way that was clean enough to suggest a single directional force, rather than the gradual friction of ordinary wear. She had no memory of catching it on anything. She held it for a moment in the driveway light, then carried it inside. Inside the house, Barney set down the binoculars. He had carried them all the way from the trunk to the kitchen table, the way a person carries something without quite registering that they are carrying it. When he set them down, he looked at the strap. The leather strap was snapped, not worn through at a worn point, not frayed at an edge where repeated use would have weakened the material over time, snapped, with a break that showed the characteristics of sudden force rather than gradual degradation. He turned it over in his hands for a moment. He could not remember any physical event during the drive that would have put that kind of stress on a leather strap. They did not sleep immediately. They were tired in the particular way that does not settle easily into rest, alert in a way that has no obvious cause, quieter than the situation seemed to require. Betty made coffee. The kitchen was exactly as they had left it, the familiar surface of the ordinary Portsmouth morning beginning to form outside the window, while inside the light was still the yellow indoor kind. They sat with the disorientation of the drive's arithmetic, with the torn dress on the back of a chair, with the snapped strap on the table, and with a quality of unease that neither of them could yet locate in any specific memory of the road behind them. The drive south from Franconia Notch, in the consciously recalled version, had happened the way drives happen. The road, the dark, the movement of headlights on the asphalt, the gradual approach of familiar territory. They remembered leaving the Notch. They remembered arriving home. What they did not have and could not produce when they searched for it was the connecting tissue of 150 miles that should have taken perhaps 3 hours and appeared, by every measure available to them, to have taken something closer to 5. Betty had been the first one to notice the light near Indian Head, and the quality of her attention on that drive had been the quality of her work, careful, precise, comparative. She was not a person who lost track of time on long drives, and Barney had made the route enough times on night shift schedules that the pacing of a late-night highway was familiar to him as a physical rhythm. The discrepancy was not a guess or a vague impression. It was a gap with measured edges. The nightcap investigator Walter Webb arrived to take the Hill's account formally in October 1961, and among the things he documented in his written report submitted that month were the physical anomalies that could be examined directly. The snapped binocular strap was one of them. Barney had kept it. He produced it at the table, and Webb noted it. The nature of the break, the absence of any wear pattern that would suggest the strap had been weakening toward this point over time. A strap worn to failure looks different from a strap that has simply given way under sudden directional force. This one belonged to the second category, and Barney had no account of any event during the drive that would place it there. The dress was another. Betty had kept that too, set apart from the rest of her clothing and not worn again. Webb examined it and noted the torn hem and the damaged zipper, both consistent with the application of some force to the fabric, neither consistent with the kind of ordinary damage that accumulates during travel. But it was the other detail, the one Betty found in the days after their return, when she looked at the dress more closely in daylight, that proved harder to set aside. Along the fabric in several locations, distributed in a pattern she could not have predicted from any conscious recollection of putting the dress on or wearing it, was a fine powder. The color was a pale pink, not quite dust, not quite cosmetic residue, and the texture and distribution were unlike anything Betty could attribute to the drive, to the car, to any surface she remembered coming into contact with between leaving Portsmouth and returning to it. She had no cosmetics of that color. The road through the White Mountains offers granite and pine, and the particular gray-brown accumulation of a mountain highway in autumn. It does not offer a fine pink powder sitting undisturbed on dress fabric in a pattern that covers several discrete locations. Betty did not disturb it. She laid the dress flat and kept it, the powder sitting on the surface where it had been found, and the dress would go on to become one of the most examined physical artifacts connected to the case, submitted for laboratory analysis on multiple occasions across the following decades, the results noting chemical compositions that were documented but never attributed with confidence to a specific known origin. The analysis did not conclude that the substance was impossible to account for within ordinary experience. They also did not conclude that it had been satisfactorily explained. The dress went from examination to examination, carrying its small deposits of pale pink material, the question of where it had come from remaining open across the span of years that the case would gather around itself. The morning of September 20th moved through its early hours. Betty called her sister Janet in Kingston, New Hampshire, later that same morning, a call that investigators would later cite as significant for what it established about the timing of the Hill's account. The call was made before any investigator had been in contact with them, before any outside framing of their experience had entered the household, before any of the machinery of investigation and documentation had begun to move around what had happened on the road. The account that Betty relayed to Janet in that call was consistent with what she and Barney would go on to report in the weeks and months that followed, and it had been given freely to a family member in the ordinary course of trying to make sense of an unusual night. Investigators noted this not as proof of anything, but as evidence that the shape of the account had not been constructed in response to outside influence. It had existed in its essential form before outside influence had arrived. There is something particular about the quality of evidence that is made before anyone asks for it. The call to Janet on the morning of September 20th belonged to that category, in the same way that Betty's instinct to set the dress aside rather than simply wash it belonged to that category, not the behavior of someone building a case, but of someone trying to hold on to something that had happened and that they did not yet have words for. In the days that followed their return, Barney found another detail that he had not noticed in the driveway. The tops of his shoes, the leather across the upper, the smooth surface that would record wear, if it were going to record it at all, had been abraded. The pattern was uniform, a consistent roughening, distributed in a way that did not correspond to any walking surface he could identify from the drive. When a shoe wears normally, the wear accumulates at the sole, at the heel, at the toe, in the places where the foot pushes and pivots against surfaces it encounters. The abrasion Barney found was not in those places. It was across the top of the leather in a pattern that suggested something other than walking, something he had no conscious memory to place against it. He set the shoes alongside the strap. He kept them. The accumulation of small physical details, the dress, the powder, the strap, the shoes, existed as a collection of documented facts that had no obvious relationship to each other, except that they had all arrived with the Hills out of the 2-hour gap in the middle of a drive from which both of them had returned home, altered in ways that were difficult to describe, but easy to inventory. Walter Webb's October 1961 report drew these details together into a formal written account that NICAP retained in its records. Webb was a careful investigator, and his report reflected that care, precise about what had been found, cautious about what it meant, attentive to the distinction between what was documented and what was inferred. The Hill's account, in his assessment, was internally consistent, and the physical evidence was genuine, meaning it was not fabricated after the fact, and its characteristics were anomalous enough that it required serious consideration. Beyond that, he did not go. The report documented the gap and the artifacts and the anomalies and set them in the record without arriving at any conclusion that the evidence could not support. The trunk of the Hills' 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air was examined in the days following their return, and it yielded something that belonged to a different category of anomaly from the dress and the shoes. On the paint of the trunk lid, distributed in a loose cluster, were a number of circular marks. They were shiny, slightly raised against the surrounding paint, and arranged in no pattern that corresponded to any ordinary use or wear of the vehicle's exterior. When Webb held a compass near them, the needle deflected. It moved away from north, not dramatically, not in a way that could be called theatrical, but consistently and in a way that was repeatable across the cluster of marks. The phenomenon was documented, added to the report, and set alongside everything else. A compass deflects near ferromagnetic materials, and the paint on a car's trunk lid contains the kind of metallic compounds that can, in certain concentrations, produce this effect. Webb noted this. He also noted that the marks themselves were not consistent with ordinary contact or wear, and that the pattern of the deflection followed the distribution of the marks. Whether the marks had anything to do with what had happened on Route 3 was a question the report did not try to answer. It was like the snapped strap and the pink powder, a fact that sat in the record without a satisfying context. In the days after the drive, and into the weeks that followed, Both Hills found their sleep disturbed in ways that were new to them. Betty's experience took the particular form of sequential, vivid dreams that she would later describe at length, highly ordered, narratively coherent, arriving on consecutive nights in a way she had not experienced before. These were distinct from what Barney was experiencing, which was a more diffuse quality of unease, and the persistence of images and impressions he could not trace to any waking event he could name. They were not, in those first weeks, comparing their internal experiences in detail. The household absorbed the anomalies of the drive in the way that households absorb things that have not yet found their category, alongside the ordinary schedule, the ordinary routines, the ordinary weight of work and weekday, and the specific rhythm of two lives lived in a specific place. Betty's letter to NICAP Director Major Donald Kehoe had been written before Webb arrived. She had read Kehoe's work before the September drive, the book on her kitchen table on an ordinary Portsmouth evening, the same table where they would later sit with the binocular strap and the torn dress. When she sat down to write to him in the days after their return, she was not writing to a stranger, but to someone whose work she had engaged with, and the letter she produced was careful and specific in the way that her professional training had made her careful and specific about things she observed and documented in the course of her work. The letter described what had happened on Route 3. It described the light and the object and the stop at Franconia Notch and the discrepancy in the drive time. It was detailed enough that Kehoe passed it to Webb, and Webb came to Portsmouth. The Hills were not people who needed to be convinced that their experience was worth documenting. The instinct to document, to call Janet, to keep the dress, to keep the strap, to write the letter, was a first instinct, not a considered position they arrived at after external persuasion. It ran in the direction of record, of preservation, of keeping the physical and textual artifacts of what had happened close enough to be examined. If examination became possible, they were reaching toward documentation before documentation had found them. The gap in the drive remained. 2 hours, or something near 2 hours, bounded at one end by the last consciously recalled events near Franconia Notch, and at the other end by the point near Ashland, New Hampshire, where both Hills reported returning to a more ordinary state of awareness, the road visible through the windshield again in the familiar way, the small lit shapes of a town appearing ahead, the clock on the dashboard showing a time that did not correspond to the road behind them. That moment near Ashland, the town lights through the glass, the abrupt return to full attention, the clock, was itself a kind of documentary edge. It was where the gap ended, at least in the version of the drive that conscious memory could supply. In the days after their return, and in the formal accounts that Webb gathered and recorded, the sequence near Ashland described both Hills suddenly more alert, as though attention had resumed after a pause that neither of them had registered as a pause. Barney was driving. The car was moving. They were past wherever the gap had opened, and they were in the ordinary flow of a late-night return drive through New Hampshire, the road familiar and the destination close, and the interval between Franconia Notch and Ashland simply gone from the version of the drive that either of them could reconstruct. Webb's report placed the total missing interval at approximately 2 hours after careful accounting for all consciously remembered stops and a conservative estimate of the driving time for the route. He was precise about the methodology. He drove the route himself to establish baseline travel times. He interviewed both Hills separately to ensure he was not allowing their accounts to fill each other's gaps. And he worked through the arithmetic of the night from multiple directions before arriving at the 2-hour figure. It was not a rough estimate. It was a careful calculation, produced by a careful investigator who had given the question the kind of attention that made the result credible. 2 hours on a 2-lane mountain highway at night, when both people in the car were experienced late-night travelers, when neither could identify any reason for the time to have gone the way it went. The road through Franconia Notch does not offer many places to stop. There are rest areas, and the Hills had stopped at one. That stop was remembered and accounted for in Webb's calculation. What remained after all the accounting was the gap, and the gap was 2 hours, and the 2 hours had left traces on a dress and a pair of shoes, and a leather binocular strap, and the paint of a car trunk, and the arithmetic of a night drive that did not add up, no matter how many times it was worked through. It is the quality of the physical evidence that distinguishes this case from accounts that rest on testimony alone. A torn hem, a snapped strap. These things can happen in travel without any extraordinary cause, and the Hills themselves would not have insisted otherwise. It is the combination of details and the specific character of each that made Webb's report take the form it did. The strap that broke without wearing, the abrasion on the leather shoes in places shoes do not abrade, the pink powder on the dress fabric in locations that corresponded to no conscious memory of contact, the compass deflecting from the paint of the trunk. These were documented facts, and individually, each of them could be set aside. Together they accumulated into something the report described as requiring serious consideration and left there. Betty and Barney Hill did not, in the weeks after their return, fit easily into any category that the people around them had available for what they were describing. They were not distressed in the way that would suggest psychological crisis. They were not, in the judgment of the colleagues and neighbors who knew them, behaving in ways that suggested fabrication or wishful thinking. They were two people who had come back from a long drive with 2 hours they could not explain, and a collection of small physical facts that pointed towards something and did not arrive anywhere. They kept their routines. Barney went to his post office shifts. Betty went to her case files. The household continued, but the dress was there, laid across the chair in the bedroom, the hem torn loose at the seam, and the zipper track pulled from the fabric in its single directional line, and the fine pale pink powder sitting undisturbed across the surface of the cloth in the particular places where it had settled. The morning light came through the window in the way it does in September in New England, low and gray and particular to that latitude, and fell across the fabric and the powder with a patience that asked nothing. The dress was not remarkable to look at. It was a dress, ordinary in every dimension except the hem and the zipper and the small pale deposits on its surface that no one had yet been able to explain. It would stay unexplained. The laboratory analyses conducted in the years following the incident produced documentation of the powder's chemical composition, results that were noted and retained in the case records, and no subsequent examination brought those results to a confident identification of origin. The dress moved through decades of investigation, the way the case itself moved through decades, examined, documented, set back down, taken up again when someone new arrived with new methodology or new instruments, the question persisting across the span of time in the way that the best questions persist, not because the answer is impossible, but because every answer that has been offered has stopped short of the full distance. The pale pink powder on the fabric, the torn hem, the compass moving away from north near the paint of the car trunk, the clean break in the leather strap, the 2 hours at the edge of the mountains between Franconia Notch and Ashland, where the road went through without leaving a trace in the memory of the two people who had driven it. Betty's dress lay across the chair in the bedroom of the house on Remoraire Road, in the pale early light of a September morning, the hem loose and the powder patient on the cloth, and outside the window the street was quiet, and the neighborhood was still, and the ordinary day was beginning its approach in the way that ordinary days do. Unhurried, indifferent to the question, the dress was sitting inside, entirely unaltered by the fact that 2 hours of a September night had gone somewhere that no one had yet been able to find. In the quiet of a Portsmouth morning, in the days just after the 20th of September, 1961, Betty Hill sat down at a table with a notebook open in front of her and wrote. The house was still. Whatever had happened on the road through the White Mountains was already 3 days behind her, and the investigators had not yet come, and the hypnosis sessions were years away from beginning. There was only the notebook and the pen, and the particular quality of a New England morning in early autumn, pale and unhurried, coming through the windows of the house on Remoraire Road. She had woken from another dream. She wrote it down before the images could move. This was the third morning she had done this. The dreams had begun the night after the incident, or close to it, arriving in sequence and with a continuity she described as unlike anything in her ordinary dream experience. Not fragmentary, not shifting, not the usual dissolving logic of sleep. These were narrative. They moved from one moment to the next with something that felt, when she woke, like the coherence of memory, rather than the ordinary looseness of dreaming, and so she recorded them. She sat at the table and wrote what she recalled, in the order she recalled it, in the clear and specific handwriting her colleagues at the State Welfare Office would have recognized immediately as hers. There would be 5 dreams in 10 days. Each one she wrote down in full, as close to waking as she could manage, before the shape of it softened at the edges, the way shapes do in the hours after sleep. The writing was unhurried. The accounts ran to several pages each. She was not performing. She was not writing for anyone. She was doing what a careful observer does when something unusual has occurred, and the only available instrument is a pen and a notebook, and the discipline to use them before the moment passes. The dreams, as she wrote them, described a sequence of events that followed a kind of procedural logic. She was aboard a craft. The walls curved. The lighting was indirect, sourceless in the way of certain institutional spaces where the light seems to come from the material of the ceiling itself rather than from any fixed point. She was separated from Barney. She was taken into a room. In the being who appeared to conduct the examination, she described him as a leader, a figure who communicated in ways she found comprehensible, who answered her questions when she asked them, explained to her what was being done and why, in the measured way of someone performing a professional task. The examination was physical and specific. One detail she recorded was the insertion of a long needle into her navel, which she was told was a pregnancy test. Researchers who read the account in subsequent years noted that this was a notable detail for 1961. The procedure she described bore a loose resemblance to what would later be called amniocentesis, a technique that was in its earliest experimental stages in that period, and that had not entered any general public awareness she could plausibly have encountered. This is documented. What it means is not established, but the detail sits in the record, noted and unresolved, as so much else in this case does. What drew sustained attention from the investigators who came later was not only the content of the dreams, but their form. 5 sequential, internally consistent, narratively coherent accounts, written down before any external input had been received, before any investigator had asked a question, before any hypnosis had been suggested, before the shape of the case had been discussed with anyone outside the Hill's immediate circle. Betty had called her sister Janet in Kingston the morning after the incident. She had written to NICAP. She had kept records. This pattern of documentation, reaching toward evidence rather than away from it, defined her handling of the incident from the beginning. The dreams were part of that. The notebook was part of that, and the drawing was the fullest expression of it. Somewhere in those first 10 days, Betty drew a map. She drew it from memory, in pencil, on a sheet of paper. It depicted roughly a dozen stars arranged in a loose cluster, connected to one another by lines. The lines were not all the same. Some were solid, drawn with a deliberate, continuous stroke. Others were broken, interrupted, composed of shorter dashes with space between them, and some stars had no lines connecting them to others at all. When she was asked about the lines in the years that followed, Betty described them as she remembered being told. The solid lines represented frequently traveled routes, paths between star systems that were used regularly. The broken lines were paths traveled less often, occasional or exploratory. The unconnected stars were places that had been visited but were not part of any regular route, curiosities perhaps, or simply markers of a wider awareness. This description did not come from any astronomy text. Betty Hill had no formal training in astronomy. She had no reason to construct a navigational schema with this level of internal logic if she were improvising. The distinction between solid and broken lines, between frequently and infrequently traveled routes, and the existence of stars connected to no routes at all. These were not decorations, they were a system. Whether the system reflected a real navigational map shown to her aboard a craft, or whether it was a coherent artifact produced by her dreaming mind from some other source, is a question the record does not resolve. What the record does contain is the drawing itself. In pencil, on paper, the lines holding their geometry in a way that would matter years later when someone else looked at them from a very different angle. She had produced the drawing entirely before any hypnosis had taken place. This is a documented fact, verified by the chronology of the case. The hypnosis sessions with Dr. Benjamin Simon in Boston did not begin until January of 1964, more than 2 years after the incident in September of 1961. Betty's notebook, her written dream accounts, and her hand-drawn star map all predate those sessions by years. They exist independently of anything said under hypnosis, independent of any investigator's framing, independent of any suggested or reconstructed narrative. They are primary documents. They come from the nights when Betty Hill sat alone with a notebook and a pen and wrote down what she recalled when she woke. The configuration of stars in her drawing did not correspond to any recognizable constellation. A constellation is a pattern meaningful from Earth, shapes organized by the way they appear from this planet's particular position in the sky. Betty's drawing was not organized around any familiar grouping. The arrangement was not the Big Dipper, not Orion, not any pattern she could have lifted from a popular star chart or a science magazine of the period. The spatial relationships between the points were precise enough that investigators who studied the drawing described it as having the quality of a genuine spatial memory rather than an improvised sketch. Precise, not in the way of something carefully calculated, but in the way of something remembered, the way a person can draw a room they once stood in with reasonable spatial accuracy without being able to explain how they retained the proportions. Betty herself, when asked to account for the drawing in the years after she produced it, described it as simply what she remembered. She did not claim to understand the astronomy of it. She drew what she had seen. The drawing was passed along to investigators and became part of the case file that Walter Webb and other NICAP researchers studied in the years following the incident. It was examined, it was considered, and for several years it remained what it had always been, a pencil drawing on paper, precise and strange, with no established correspondence to any known star configuration, filed alongside the other physical and documentary evidence of a case that had not closed. Then, in 1968, a woman in Ohio named Marjorie Fish began to look at it differently. Marjorie Fish was a school teacher and an amateur astronomer. She had read about the Hill case and had encountered reproductions of Betty's star map in the course of her reading, and she became interested in a specific question, not whether the map was genuine, not what had produced it, but whether the geometric configuration it depicted could be matched to an actual arrangement of stars, as seen from some real point in space. This was a precise and modest question. It did not require her to endorse any interpretation of the case. It required her to work. She worked for several years. She consulted stellar catalog data, the systematic catalogs of nearby star systems, and their three-dimensional positions relative to one another in space, the kind of data that had been assembled by astronomers over decades of careful measurement. She built a three-dimensional model by hand, using beads and wire, constructing a physical representation of the positions of nearby star systems in space, as the catalogs described them. The model was assembled in her Ohio home, on a surface she could move around, turning it slowly to find angles at which its geometry matched the geometry in Betty Hill's pencil drawing. The process was painstaking and years long. Fish was working from stellar data available in the late 1960s, a period when the catalogs of nearby stars were reasonably well established, but not yet complete, and when the computational tools that would later make this kind of analysis straightforward did not yet exist. She was doing it by hand, physically, turning a wire and bead model under a light in a room in Ohio, looking for a match. She found what she described as a match in the view from the Zeta Reticuli binary star system, a pair of stars located approximately 39 light-years from Earth in the southern constellation Reticulum. The configuration of stars visible from that vantage point in Fish's model corresponded, in her analysis, to the pattern Betty had drawn on paper in Portsmouth in the days after September 1961. The match was not perfect in every detail. No such comparison, built from human memory and hand-constructed models, could be expected to be. But the correspondence was close enough that Fish judged it significant and prepared a formal analysis for publication. The paper appeared in the astronomy journal, Astronomy, in 1974. Fish's analysis was presented alongside a reproduction of Betty Hill's drawing, with star names annotated, the Zeta Reticuli binary system, identified in print for the first time in connection with the Hill case. The analysis laid out the correspondence between the drawing and the stellar configuration Fish had identified, explained her methodology, and offered no conclusion beyond the observation that the match appeared to be meaningful, that the probability of the configuration appearing by chance in the relevant region of nearby star space was, in her estimation, low enough to warrant attention. The publication prompted a response from the astronomical community. Astronomer David Saunders, a statistician who had worked on the Condon Committee's examination of UFO reports in the late 1960s, conducted an independent statistical analysis of Fish's identification. Saunders found that the geometric match exceeded what would be expected from chance across the population of nearby stars visible from the relevant vantage point, and his analysis was cited in subsequent discussions of the case as a supporting data point for Fish's identification. Neither Fish nor Saunders claimed to have proven anything about the origin of the drawing or the nature of the event that produced it. They were asking a narrower question, whether this pattern, if drawn from knowledge, could reflect a real star configuration, and their answer was that it appeared it could. The publication also drew critical responses. Other astronomers examined the stellar catalog data Fish had used and raised questions about whether different stars, or stars not included in the catalogs available to Fish in the late 1960s, might alter the configuration she had identified. As stellar measurement improved over subsequent decades and more precise data became available, some researchers argued that the identification became less certain rather than more. The catalog data improved. The three-dimensional positions of nearby stars were refined, and some of those refinements complicated the precise geometry on which Fish's match depended. This is part of the record. The analysis was conducted, the match was proposed, the statistical support was offered, and the criticism was also offered, and the question was not closed in either direction. What persists through all of it is the drawing. The drawing was produced in 1961 in pencil in the days after September 20th, before any investigator had suggested what it might represent. It depicts roughly a dozen stars connected by solid and broken lines, with some stars unconnected, and with a distinction between root types that has its own internal logic. Whether that logic came from a genuine navigational display Betty observed aboard an actual craft, or from some other process, the particular organization of a dreaming mind, the echo of something seen in a magazine, or a text that she did not consciously remember, a pattern produced by the geometry of her own cognition under stress. None of these possibilities has been established, and none has been ruled out. Dr. Simon, the Boston psychiatrist who conducted the hypnosis sessions years later, held the position that Betty's dreams had a psychological origin and did not constitute literal memories of physical events. Researchers who studied the star map independently of the hypnosis evidence held other positions. The drawing sits at the intersection of all of these positions, committed to none of them, consistent with more than one interpretation. Betty, for her part, did not spend the years after the incident adjusting the drawing. She did not revise it as new stellar data became available, did not claim new information arrived through channels she could not describe. The drawing she produced in 1961 was the drawing Fish examined in the late 1960s and the drawing published in Astronomy in 1974. It did not change. It held its geometry across the years the way pencil lines on paper hold their geometry, patiently, without argument, available to whoever looked. There is a quality to the drawing that is worth sitting with, which is the specificity of the line variation, the distinction between solid and broken lines, between frequently and infrequently traveled routes, is not the kind of detail that decorates a sketch or fills space. It is the kind of detail that comes from a specific remembered explanation. If Betty had been improvising a star map, the lines would most likely be uniform or varied for visual interest in the way that improvisational decoration varies. The variation she used was systematic. It encoded information. The broken lines were not less carefully drawn than the solid lines. They were differently drawn, in a way that matched the distinction she described when she talked about what the lines meant. The stars with no connections at all served a third function in the schema she described, not routes, not destinations, but noted presences, bodies in the wider space that had been visited without becoming part of the network of regular travel. This level of internal consistency in a detail this small is one of the features of the drawing that investigators and researchers returned to across the decades. The case remained open. It is not conclusive. It is not proof. But it is the kind of detail that resists the simpler explanations without demanding the more extraordinary ones. The kind of detail that holds the case in the particular uncomfortable middle ground where it has always lived. The 5 dreams Betty recorded in those 10 days in September 1961 varied in their specificity and in their emotional quality. The first was longer and more procedural. The sequence of events aboard the craft, the examination, the conversation with the figure she described as a leader. Later dreams in the sequence were shorter and had a different quality, more fragmentary, more emotionally residual than narratively complete. She described the dreams as disturbing in the way that unusual and vivid experiences are disturbing, not in the way of nightmares, not in the register of ordinary dread. They had a quality she found hard to place, more like remembering than dreaming, which was itself part of what made them feel unlike her ordinary sleep. She wrote them all down. The writing was the thing she could do. She was a professional, trained to observe and document and keep records, and in the absence of any other instrument available to her in those first days, that training was what she reached for. She did not wait for investigators to suggest she write things down. She did not wait to be told that documentation would be valuable. She sat with the notebook and she wrote, and then she drew the map, and then she called her sister, and then she wrote to NICAP. And the case she built in those early days with her pen and her notebook was the case that had something to hand to investigators when they arrived. Marjorie Fish, working in Ohio 7 years later with her wire and her beads, was in some sense following a path that Betty had already laid down, not in terms of interpretation, not in terms of conclusion, but in terms of the basic act of careful attention to a specific question. Fish's question was whether the geometry in Betty's drawing could be found in real space. She spent years asking it. She turned her model slowly under a light in a room in Ohio, looking for the angle at which the pattern resolved. When she found the angle she found compelling, she documented her methodology and submitted her analysis for publication and accepted the scrutiny that followed. The criticism came, the questions were asked, the stellar data were re-examined, the case remained open. The broken lines in Betty's drawing, the lighter, more tentative strokes she used to indicate routes traveled less often, are perhaps the most quietly particular detail in the whole document. They are drawn with a different pressure than the solid lines. A person looking at the drawing can see, in the marks themselves, a distinction that corresponds to the distinction in meaning Betty described when she explained what the lines represented. The solid lines go to the stars visited often, the stars that form the main network of whatever travel the drawing was meant to represent. The broken lines go to places visited less, places on the margins of the regular routes. The unconnected stars float in the space between them, known but not traveled to, present in the awareness of whoever made the original that Betty was drawing from memory, whether that original was a display aboard a craft 39 light-years from home, or a pattern produced by Betty's sleeping mind from elements she had absorbed and rearranged in the particular alchemy of dreaming, or something else entirely that neither of those categories quite captures. The drawing does not say. It is a pencil drawing on paper. It holds the geometry it has always held. The lines do not move toward resolution. They do not argue for one interpretation over another. They simply remain in the precise arrangement Betty gave them on a quiet morning in Portsmouth when the house was still and she sat down with a pen to write the last of what she could remember before the images faded. The drawing now rests in an archival folder in the Milne Special Collections at the University of New Hampshire, where the Betty and Barney Hill papers, form a collection that spans correspondence, photographs, documentation of the physical evidence gathered in the days after the incident, the written dream journal, and the records of years of investigation by researchers and investigators who read the files and asked their questions, and in many cases went away with the questions still open. The folder that contains the drawing is acid-free. The pencil lines have not significantly faded. The solid roots and the broken roots and the unconnected stars are as distinguishable now as they were when Betty drew them in September of 1961, before any investigator had come, before any session had been recorded, before Marjorie Fish had heard of the case. A researcher who visits the Milne Special Collections and requests the Betty and Barney Hill papers can ask to see the drawing. It will be brought out in its folder. It will be placed on the table. The lines will be there, pencil on paper, the geometry patient and unchanged, the broken strokes still lighter than the solid ones, the unconnected stars still floating at the edges of the pattern. The researcher can look at it for as long as they like. They can take notes. They can photograph it under archival guidelines. They can bring to it everything they know about stellar cartography and dream psychology and the documented history of this particular case, and they can hold all of that knowledge while looking at a pencil drawing made in a quiet house in Portsmouth by a woman who had trained herself to write things down before they disappeared. The drawing will not tell them more than it has ever told anyone, but it will be there, specific and tangible and still, in the way that primary documents are still, unhurried, patient, asking nothing of the person who looks at it except attention. In the years after the case became widely known, through John Fuller's account published in 1966, and through the investigations that followed, Betty Hill continued to keep records. She continued to correspond with researchers. She continued to be specific about what she remembered and careful about the distinction between what she knew and what she did not know. She donated her papers to the University of New Hampshire before her death in 2004. The donation was orderly and comprehensive. It reflected the same instinct that had led her to the notebook in those first September mornings. The instinct that evidence matters, that records should be kept, that the right response to an unusual experience is documentation rather than silence. The 5 sequential dreams she recorded in the 10 days after September 20th, 1961, survive in their original written form. The handwriting is clear. The accounts are specific. The narrative coherence she described. The quality of these dreams that made them feel less like ordinary dreaming and more like the particular work of a mind trying to recover and organize something it had encountered is visible in the way the accounts are structured, in the way they move from detail to detail with a consistency that does not dissolve from one morning's record to the next. They are the work of a careful observer documenting what was available to be documented at the only moment when the images were fresh enough to hold. The star map is the most discussed element of this case's documentary record, and it is easy to understand why. It is visual. It is geometric. It can be compared to other geometric data in a way that written accounts cannot. It has a concreteness that makes it feel like it is reaching towards some kind of answer. But it is worth holding the map alongside the notebook, alongside the written dreams, alongside the telephone call to Janet in Kingston the morning after the incident, alongside the careful letter Betty wrote to Donald Kehoe at NICAP in the days that followed. All of these are the same gesture. All of them are Betty Hill at a table with an instrument in her hand, trying to preserve what was there before it was gone. The geometry of the drawing holds in the acid-free folder where it rests. The solid lines connect the stars that the drawing's internal logic identifies as frequently visited. The broken lines reached toward the less traveled places. The stars with no connections at all float at the edges of the pattern, present in the map, present in the space the map represents, connected to nothing, but still noted, still placed, still part of whatever knowledge the drawing was drawn from. That is what the drawing is. A record of placement, a set of positions held in pencil on paper, produced by a woman sitting alone at a table in a quiet house on a gray New England morning, writing down what she could still see before the seeing faded. The positions are still there. The pencil lines are still there. The pencil lines are still there. The drawing rests in its folder, unhurried and unchanged, available to any researcher who comes to the Milne Special Collections and asks to see it. The geometry patient on the paper, the solid and broken lines holding what they have always held, the whole small, careful document still open, as the case that contains, it has always been open, as the space the lines reach toward has always been wide and still and quiet and largely unknown. In January of 1964, in a clinical office in Boston, a reel-to-reel tape recorder sat on a side table with its reels turning slowly. The room was quiet in the particular way that soundproofed rooms are quiet. Not silent, exactly, but held away from the street outside, from the ordinary city continuing beyond the window. Dr. Benjamin Simon had arranged the session with care. Barney Hill sat across from him, and the tape turned, and what came next was recorded onto magnetic tape in a voice that began at a measured pace and would not remain there. Dr. Benjamin Simon was not a researcher on the margins of his field. He had spent years using clinical hypnosis to treat soldiers returning from combat, men whose minds had organized their experiences in ways that ordinary conversation could not reach, and he had developed a precise, methodical approach to hypnotherapy that his colleagues regarded as both rigorous and reliable. He was, by professional formation, a man who knew the difference between what a mind sincerely held and what had actually occurred, and he knew, more precisely than most, that those two things did not always correspond. He brought both of those understandings to the sessions he had agreed to conduct with Barney and Betty Hill, and he kept them in mind throughout the months that followed. The decision to approach Dr. Simon had not come quickly. Barney Hill had been experiencing what his own physician described as a pattern of anxiety and physical complaint that had no clear medical origin. The nights had not been restful. The drive through the White Mountains remained in memory as a series of fragments that would not arrange themselves into a continuous sequence, and Barney had been referred through a succession of consultations before arriving at Dr. Simon's practice. Betty had come with him. She had been keeping her own record, the dream journal she had begun in the days after September 20th, the careful written account of 5 sequential dreams she had set down before any investigator had made contact with them. And she brought that record into the sessions, the way she brought everything, methodically, with the kind of careful attention her professional training had made habitual. Simon began the sessions with Barney in January. He made a deliberate and documented choice to keep the two subjects separate, to hypnotize Barney and Betty independently, to withhold from each of them the specific content of the other's session until all the sessions were complete. This was not a casual procedural decision. Simon understood that memory, particularly memory recalled under hypnosis, was susceptible to contamination. If both subjects were to recall similar events, the similarity would mean something only if those recalls had been produced without cross-reference. He built the separation into the design of the process from the first session forward, and he maintained it through the months that followed. Barney's sessions were marked from early on by emotional responses that the tape recorded without diminishment. His voice would begin at a certain register, measured, cooperative, the voice of a man trying to be helpful and precise, and then something would shift in what he was describing, some threshold in the recalled sequence, and the voice would change. The clinical literature on hypnosis notes that subjects recalling traumatic material sometimes exhibit physiological responses that mirror the original distress, elevated heart rate, irregular breathing, motor responses corresponding to described events. What the tape captured in Barney Hill's sessions was something in that register. He wept. He described a circular room with a curved ceiling and walls that curved inward, and he described beings whose method of communication he experienced as direct, rather than verbal, not sound, but impression, something that arrived in his mind without having traveled through the air between them. He described an examination. He described specific instruments. He described the interior of a space that he said he remembered, but could not account for having entered by any means he could identify in his waking understanding of the night. The tape reels turned through all of it. Betty's sessions produced their own account, told separately and in different language, with the particular rhythms and emphases of a different mind working through the same territory. She described entering a craft. She described a room with curved walls and indirect lighting, a quality of light that was present but had no visible source she could identify. She described the physical examination she had already recorded in her dream journal in the days after September 20th, the needle, the explanation offered to her by one of the beings for what was being done, the star map she had been shown when she asked where they had come from. The details of her hypnotic recall corresponded in broad structure to what she had already written down months before the sessions began, and in many specific details to what Barney was describing in his separate sessions, which she had not heard. Simon noted the correspondences carefully. He also noted what they could and could not establish, the professional conclusions Simon reached, stated in his own words, in interviews and in the documentation that surrounded the case, was not a simple one. He found both Barney and Betty Hill psychologically normal. He said this directly and more than once, in terms that left no ambiguity. These were not individuals prone to fantasy, not individuals with a documented history of delusion, not individuals who had constructed this account as a deliberate deception. He found their distress genuine and their sincerity beyond professional doubt. At the same time, Simon proposed a mechanism for what might account for the shared content of their hypnotic recalls without requiring that the recalled events had physically occurred. Betty's vivid, narratively coherent dreams, the 5 she had written down in the days after September 20th, the accounts that had gone into her journal before any hypnosis had taken place, had been present in the household for more than 2 years by the time the sessions with Simon began. Simon's hypothesis was that those dream narratives, absorbed over time into the shared mental environment of a marriage, might have entered Barney's unconscious in ways he was not aware of, emerging under hypnosis as recalled experience. He called it, in various framings, a form of shared or induced fantasy, not deception, not psychosis, but a genuine psychological event that both subjects experienced as real, precisely because it was, to them, real. He stated this hypothesis clearly. He also stated, with equal clarity, that he could not fully account for the 2 hours of travel time that remained unrecovered even after the sessions were complete, and that the physical evidence, the dress, the binocular strap, the markings that had been documented, remained outside the frame of his professional conclusion, where he said he could not offer a fully satisfying explanation. He said the case remained, in his professional view, genuinely puzzling in its physical dimensions, even as he held to his psychological interpretation of the hypnotic content. That position, two things held simultaneously, neither collapsing the other, was the position Simon maintained for the rest of his professional engagement with the case. The sessions ran through June of 1964. When they were complete, Simon had hours of recorded material on labeled tape reels stored in their cases, the voices of Barney and Betty Hill, preserved on magnetic oxide with the particular fidelity of a good reel-to-reel machine running at a steady speed in a quiet room. John Fuller, the journalist who would go on to write The Interrupted Journey, used those recordings as the documentary foundation of his account, which was published in 1966 and brought the Hills case into wide public awareness for the first time. The book was specific in its sourcing. It quoted from the session tapes directly. It named Simon by name and reported his professional conclusions with precision. Fuller was not writing advocacy, he was writing documentation, and the book's durability over the decades that followed owed something to that distinction. Barney Hill died in February of 1969. He was 46 years old. He had lived with the questions of the September 1961 drive for 7.5 years, through the investigations and the sessions with Simon and the book, and the public attention that followed, carrying all of it with the same steady, principled quality that his colleagues at the NAACP and the Civil Rights Commission had consistently attributed to him. He did not resolve what had happened. The question was still open when he died, as it had been open from the morning he and Betty pulled into their driveway on Remuer Road and stepped out of the car, disoriented and unable to account for the hours between. Betty continued for decades. She gave interviews. She attended conferences. She returned to the site in the White Mountains on the anniversary of the drive. She maintained her correspondence with investigators and researchers and institutions with the documentary instinct that had defined her engagement with the case from its first days. From the morning she picked up the phone to call her sister Janet and report what had happened before the account could blur at its edges. From the careful letter she wrote to NICAP's Donald Kehoe before any investigator came to them. She kept her records in order. She was specific about what she claimed to know, and equally specific about what she did not. She died in October of 2004, and what she left behind was not only her own account, but an archive. The Betty and Barney Hill papers at the University of New Hampshire's Milne Special Collections and archives contain the documentary record of the case in the form Betty built it. The dream journal is there. The plain notebook she began in the days after September 20th, 1961. The handwriting careful, and even on the pages, the 5 sequential dream accounts set down before any hypnotist or investigator had come within range of the household. Researchers who have held the journal and read it in the archival reading room have noted the particularity of the language, the specific spatial details, the sequences that hold their internal logic from one entry to the next, the consistency of the imagery across 5 separate mornings of writing. The accounts in the journal do not feel constructed toward an effect. They feel observed in the way Betty Hill's professional training had taught her to observe, carefully, precisely, with attention to the detail that would not have been there if the account had been assembled from general impressions rather than specific memory. The star map is there too, the original hand-drawn version, pencil on paper, the lines she put down from memory of what she recalled being shown aboard the craft, sits in its archival folder in an acid-free sleeve, available to any researcher who makes an appointment to see it. The lines are still there. Pencil on paper does not fade in the way that other media do when properly stored, and the Milne's archival conditions are careful. The geometry of the drawing, the roughly dozen points, the solid lines connecting some of them, the broken lines connecting others, the variation in line weight that Betty attributed to a distinction between frequently traveled and less traveled routes, holds on the paper in exactly the form she put it there. It is a specific, precise object made by a specific person in a specific room, and it has outlasted a great deal of speculation about what it does or does not represent. Marjorie Fish's analysis, the three-dimensional model she built by hand in her Ohio home in the late 1960s, the slow work of constructing a wire and bead representation of nearby stellar systems from catalog data and turning it until the angles matched those in Betty's drawing, identified the configuration Betty had drawn as consistent with the view from the Zeta Reticuli binary star system, approximately 39 light-years from Earth. Fish published her analysis in the journal Astronomy in 1974, where it appeared alongside a reproduced version of Betty's map, with the star names annotated in print. David Saunders, an astronomer, conducted a separate statistical analysis of the geometric match and concluded that the correspondence exceeded what chance probability would produce. Other astronomers have examined the same data and reached different conclusions, noting that the stellar catalog data available in 1969 when Fish was building her model has been revised in subsequent decades as observational techniques improved, and that some of the stars in Fish's identification are no longer considered as close to our solar system as the 1969 catalog suggested. The scientific community has not reached consensus on what Betty's map represents, and that absence of consensus is itself part of the record, not a resolution in either direction, but the state in which the question actually rests. What the map is, as a physical fact, is a drawing made by Betty Hill from her account of something she recalled. What it might represent beyond that, a memory of something shown to her, a dream image that held the form of a diagram, an unconscious arrangement of points that by coincidence or by more than coincidence corresponded to a stellar pattern, has not been established. Betty held her own view. She was clear about it throughout her life, consistent in the way she described the experience and the drawing, specific in the details she claimed, and careful not to claim beyond them. Whatever the drawing is, it is hers, and it is still there, in the folder, in the reading room, under archival light. The case as a whole has that quality, the quality of something that has not been closed because no one has found the mechanism that would close it. Simon's hypothesis about shared dream contamination accounts for certain features of the hypnotic recalls, while not accounting for others. The physical evidence, the dress, the shoes, the binocular strap, the compass deflection that Walter Webb documented in his NICAP report in October of 1961 sits outside the frame of the psychological interpretation, documented and unresolved in the way that physical evidence remains, when no one has found a satisfying explanation for how it arrived in the state it was found. The time discrepancy, calculated against the known route, and the Hills' account of their conscious stops has not been filled by any reconstruction of the drive that uses only events both Hills could recall. 2 hours remain unaccounted for. The investigation did not close them. This is not an unusual condition for cases of this kind. The documented record of reported encounters with phenomena that resist conventional explanation carries throughout its length the consistent feature of questions that return unresolved to the same place they started. What is perhaps particular about the Hill case, what has kept it in academic citation and journalistic investigation, and archival inquiry for more than 6 decades is the specific combination of elements it assembled: two named, documented individuals with professional standing and multiple character witnesses, a contemporaneous phone call to a family member made before any investigator arrived, a written dream journal produced before hypnosis, a hand-drawn map that could be submitted to geometric analysis, physical evidence documented by a named investigator in a formal written report, a psychiatrist of recognized standing who recorded his sessions, stated his conclusions precisely, and held his uncertainty honestly alongside those conclusions. The case is not compelling because it is strange. Many cases are strange. It is particular because of the care with which it was recorded, the layers of documentation it accumulated across the years, and the way each layer holds without the others being required to confirm it. In the reading room at the Milne Special Collections, the archival materials are arranged with the care that university special collections bring to their holdings. The correspondence files, Betty's letters to Nightcap spanning decades, the responses from investigators and researchers who engaged with the case over the years that followed, occupy their own folders. The photographs are there, labeled and stored. The documentation of the physical evidence is there in the forms Walter Webb submitted, the handwriting of a careful investigator setting down what he observed and what he measured and what he could not explain. And the dream journal is there, and the star map is there, and the whole record of two people who encountered something on a mountain road in September of 1961 and spent the rest of their lives trying to understand what it was without pretending to a certainty they did not have. Betty Hill's handwriting in the dream journal is still legible. That is not a minor thing, though it sounds like one. Handwriting from 1961, kept under proper conditions in a well-maintained archive, remains readable by anyone who sits down with it. The sentences Betty wrote in the days after September 20th, the specific images she recorded before they could fade, the sequences she set down in the careful, even script her colleagues had always associated with her professional work, can be read today in exactly the form she wrote them. The words she chose, the details she included, the moments in the dream where she pressed the pen down slightly harder, the places where the handwriting remains as steady as the rest. All of it is there. There is something in the persistence of documents that holds its own particular quality, not the resolution of what the documents describe, but the simple fact that they continue to exist while the questions they record remain open. The tape reels that Dr. Simon's reel-to-reel machine filled in 1964 were the documentary foundation for Fuller's book, and the book was the foundation for the public account of the case, and the public account sent researchers back to the original materials, and the researchers, some of them confirming aspects of the record, others disputing interpretations, a few finding things in the documents that had not been noticed before, kept the case alive in the way that living cases are kept alive, by continued attention from people who have not yet found a reason to stop looking. The question produces inquiry. The inquiry produces documents. The documents produce further inquiry. And the case remains open, not because no one has looked, but because everyone who has looked carefully enough has found the same edge, the place where the established record runs out, and the explanation has not yet arrived. The last formal session with Dr. Simon concluded in June of 1964. Barney Hill walked out of that Boston office and into the summer street with no more certainty than he had brought into the sessions 5 months before. The sessions had given him a way to hold the experience, a clinical frame, a professional interpretation, a context in which his own responses to what had happened were neither pathologized nor dismissed. Simon had treated him with the seriousness that his professional practice demanded of all its subjects, and Barney had found in that seriousness something useful, even if it did not resolve the central question. He went back to Portsmouth. He went back to the post office and the NAACP work and the Civil Rights Commission appointments and the ordinary texture of a life in a northern New England city in the middle of the 1960s. The September drive remained in memory. The 2 hours remained unaccounted for. He continued. Betty continued, too, and her continuation was active rather than passive. Interviews, correspondence, public appearances, careful maintenance of the record in a form that would outlast her. She understood, in the practical way that professional social workers understand things, that the credibility of an account rests on documentation, and she built documentation the way a skilled practitioner builds a case file, systematically, specifically, with attention to what could be verified and honest silence on what could not. When she donated her personal papers to the University of New Hampshire, she was doing what she had always done. She was making sure the record existed in a form that could be checked. The University of New Hampshire holds the collection now in the Milnes Special Collections and Archives, where it has been cited in multiple academic publications and journalistic investigations as a primary source. Scholars have sat with the Dream Journal. Researchers have examined the star map. Historians of the UAP phenomenon have traced the correspondence files and noted the precision with which Betty maintained her records across decades. The collection is not a closed archive. It is accessible to researchers who request access, which is exactly the condition Betty intended when she arranged the donation. She was not hiding anything. She was not amplifying anything. She was making sure that what had been documented remained available in its original form for anyone who wanted to look carefully at what the documentation actually contained. The star map in its archival sleeve does not press any interpretation upon the person who examines it. It is a drawing on paper made from memory by a woman who described having seen a specific image on a specific night in September of 1961, and who set down what she could recall of that image in pencil before any investigator arrived, before any hypnosis session took place, before the case had become a case in the public sense of that word. The lines are light in some places and heavier in others. The solid connections and the broken connections are clearly distinguishable. The arrangement of points has the quality of something remembered rather than invented, the spatial precision of a person trying to reproduce something they saw, rather than the looser arrangement that tends to appear when someone constructs an image from imagination without a specific referent to hold them to accuracy. Whether what Betty was reproducing was a genuine memory of a physical object, a dream image that held the structural logic of a diagram, or something else that the existing categories have not yet found a way to name, that question has not been answered. The drawing remains what it is. The question remains what it is. The White Mountains are still there on a clear night in September, rising against a sky that holds more stars than most people see from where they ordinarily live. U.S. Route 3 still passes through Franconia Notch, granite walls rising on either side, the tree line, a dark, irregular edge against the sky, the road quieter now than it was in 1961, but not entirely different in its essential character, the particular isolation of a two-lane mountain highway. In the hours after midnight, the way the darkness deepens between the cliff faces and the tree cover, travelers still pass through that stretch of road without incident, most of them, the great majority, arriving where they intended to arrive at the time the drive would logically take. The Notch does not particularly hold on to what happened there in September of 1961. The landscape is indifferent to its own history in the way that landscapes are. The stars above it continue in their own patient arrangements, the Zeta Reticuli system among them, approximately 39 light years out, visible from the southern hemisphere, but not from New Hampshire. Binary stars orbiting one another at a distance that would take human spacecraft at current speeds longer than civilization has so far existed to reach. Dr. Simon's tapes held the voices. The journal held the dreams. The map held its geometry. And in the reading room of the Milne Special Collections at the University of New Hampshire, where the light is steady and the air is carefully conditioned against the degradation of paper and magnetic media and all the other materials that records are made of, the Betty and Barney Hill papers continue to exist in the ordered form that Betty Hill built for them. The folders are labeled. The documents are in their acid-free sleeves. The correspondence is arranged. The star map is there, in its place in the collection, the pencil lines patient on the paper, the solid roots and the broken roots, and the cluster of points that may be nothing more than a dream's geometry, or maybe something else entirely, holding their arrangement quietly, the way things hold when they have been properly cared for, waiting without urgency for the next person who comes to look. The question the case leaves behind is not a loud one. It does not demand an answer. It has been living in the archival folders for more than 60 years without one, and it shows no sign of being troubled by the absence. What happened on that September drive, in the stretch of 2 hours that the Hills could not account for when they pulled into the driveway on Remuera Road in the pre-dawn hours of September 20th, remains what it has always been, a documented gap in a documented account, surrounded by the careful records of two people who did not look away from it and did not pretend to know more than they knew. The tape still holds Barney's voice. The journal still holds Betty's handwriting.